Do you think that there are topics that, because of certain trends within American religious history or even in religious studies, that we, as scholars, don't focus on, or somehow have sort of lost sight of certain issues and groups and movements?
Yes, I do. And however, I'm encouraged by the fact that recent historiography has shown what can be done for previously neglected group. Books that I've been impressed with that I could have mentioned too by younger scholars would include the volumes by John Giggy and Ed Blum and Wallace Best. I'm missing some people that I want to talk about. Curtis Evans have shown how much good work is there to be done on African American churches and religious movements that people knew about but had not really worked hard at the source collection, interpretation, and empathetic understanding. Again, as a kind of old-fashioned way of looking at things, I don't think that we know nearly as much as we need to know about the religious practices and the devotional life of some of the main groups. It's been kind of a joke since Clifford Geertz's work to say that many students of American religion know much more about the ritual significance of the Balinese cockfight than they do about Southern Baptist immersion practices. Well, these are important and deserve to be seriously studied. I happen also to think that institutional religion continues to be important. Studies of, for example, the organization of Catholic bishops in the United States and what the bishops have done at a time of great transition in the church, great ethnic diversification in the church, are neglected topics. And because they look from the top down, they'll probably continue to be neglected so long as social history has its sway. But these are topics that will be studied at some stage, and I think will be studied better because of the insights of social historians that are brought into the picture.
I think too that Peggy Bendroth is working on a history of mainline Protestant groups, which do seem to have kind of faded from
yes,
scene.
There has been a gratifying increase in attention to African American groups, gratifying interest in attention to evangelical groups, Pentecostal groups. The main line suffers for having the reputation for being a main line, but Margaret Bendroth and others are doing good work on these matters, and I expect the problem for scholarship in the future to be too many good books rather than too few.
I wonder, in conclusion, if you could say something about when you first started your career and kind of plotted out your course, did you feel like there were mentors for you in the field, those who you look to as someone who could be a historian but also be steeped in theological subtleties and nuances to sort of fuse those two worlds? Did you find people that were mentors for you?
Mentors, I'm not sure, because I didn't have too much close personal contact with people, but certainly there was a number of scholars whose work I admired greatly, and without probably thinking consciously I'd like to write like they do, had a significant influence. Certainly Sidney Alstrom, certainly George Marsden, certainly working on communities that I was interested in and wanted to do research in. But because I did quite a bit of work in the 16th century, in the Reformation era, I came away greatly impressed by the work of A.G. Dickens, Jaroslav Pelikan, and some of the younger historians that went further with Luther and Reform studies had begun with people like John McNeill and Roland Bainton. And I think in the best of the Reformation era studies, and eventually I was able to read some of the Catholic Reformation people as well, in the best of those studies you got an obvious, you got people studying the obvious importance of doctrine, but then moving out to how doctrine affected people's lives, which means that I've been a sucker for books like Brad Gregory's Salvation at Stake and Eamon Duffy's revisionist works on the English Reformation, because these are books that recognize how important belief was, but belief put into practice.
What about Alan Heimert? Did his
Heimert's book was on my shelf, and I read it and reread it, particularly when I was working on my own dissertation, which had to do with religion and politics just before the American Revolution. I probably, at the end of the day, saw Heimert as a kind of extension of Perry Miller, whose work I admired a great deal, even though I realized at the time that this was very much elite level scholarship. Yeah, I thought Heimert was great. And not that I agreed with it all, but it just that his comprehension of the published material and the creativity of his argument, which I actually disagreed with, but the creativity of his argument linking internal religious matters to external political matters was a great inspiration.
Did someone like Timothy Smith, did he figure in your early career as someone who was an evangelical, who was in this world that didn't really have very many evangelicals in it?
I would say that Timothy Smith's work became quite important in my thinking. It wasn't directly influential early on because I was working from kind of the 18th century backwards, and then occasionally dabbling in 20th century topics, which of course leaves out the era where Timothy Smith's work was so influential. But in moving forward and thinking about the role that a practicing Christian believer might have in being an objective but empathetic historian of religious movements, Timothy Smith became a very important landmark. In fact, I've written and given talks now several times that single out Smith and George Marsden as really very important door openers for people in the more sectarian Protestant communities who had been content to write for themselves and think for themselves and really quite nervous about the broader marketplace of ideas. But Timothy Smith with his subjects and George Marsden with his subjects showed that you didn't have to do it that way, and you could be a faithful practitioner of your particular religious faith, as well as a real strong contributor to the general understanding of American history. So in that respect, although I would never exactly call Tim Smith a mentor, he was someone whose work I admired greatly and came to see his tremendous significance for people like myself who are people of faith and yet want to write with some objectivity for a broader audience.
It sounds like Grant Wacker has said some of that too about him, seeing him as someone who modeled some of this, it seems like.
Yes, and I think Grant had the added advantage of knowing Tim personally and having contact with him when they both were living in Boston when Grant was doing his graduate work. And I always envied Grant for that privilege that he had.
Well, thank you so much for your time.
My privilege.